Before you scroll, before you let your attention drift to the next thing on your screen, I need you to sit with a single thought that might change the way you see yourself forever. Somewhere inside you lives a version of you that no one has ever met, not your best friend, not the person who swore they understood you better than anyone else, not the family who watched you grow up, and strangely, not even you, because that version of you has never truly been allowed to exist. Every time it tried to emerge, something quietly pushed it back down, a message you had to answer, someone else's mood you felt responsible for fixing, an awkward silence you rushed to fill before anyone else could feel uncomfortable. Over time, you became so skilled at sensing what everyone else needed that you slowly forgot there was a you underneath all that awareness. And the strangest part is that for years you didn't even notice it happening. Because when a person disappears slowly, when the sacrifice happens one tiny piece at a time, there isn't a single dramatic moment where you can point and say, that's when I lost myself. Instead, it happens quietly, across months, across years, until one day you realize that carrying everyone else's emotional weight has become heavier than you can hold. And suddenly something inside you goes still. That stillness is usually misunderstood. From the outside, people give it names. They call it a breakdown. They call it burnout. They whisper about how the sensitive one finally couldn't handle the world. But there is something about this moment that almost nobody tells you. Something psychologists who have studied deep transformation have noticed again and again. What people call your collapse may actually be the beginning of one of the most powerful internal changes a human being can experience. Not the kind of healing people casually promise when they say, you'll be okay. Something much deeper, something irreversible, a restructuring of who you are at the level of identity itself. The person who comes out the other side is not simply a repaired version of who you used to be. It's someone who could never have existed without everything you went through. Someone stronger, not in spite of the weight you carried, but because of how long you carried it, and because of what you finally chose to set down. This moment you're in right now is not the start of your comeback. The comeback has already begun, but to understand why, you need to understand what has actually been happening inside you. Because knowing the mechanics of this transformation determines whether you merely survive it or whether you use it to rebuild your life from the inside out. People who are deeply empathetic rarely reach their breaking point by accident. They arrive there through a pattern that started so early in life that it never felt like a behavior. It felt like breathing. It usually begins in childhood. For many empaths, there was someone in the home whose emotional state controlled the atmosphere. A parent, a caregiver, someone whose mood determined whether the environment felt safe or unstable. They weren't always cruel. They weren't necessarily abusive in obvious ways, but they were unpredictable. Their emotions shifted suddenly, and when their mood changed, the entire room changed with it. The air felt different. Sometimes it became tense, sometimes explosive, sometimes cold and silent. And the child living in that environment had to learn how to adapt very quickly. So they developed a skill. They began reading the room. They started noticing tiny signals most people overlook. A slight change in tone, the way someone held their shoulders, a sigh, the sound of a door closing just a little harder than usual. Without realizing it, that child became an expert in other people's emotional states. For a while, this ability actually helped. It protected them. If they noticed the shift early enough, they could adjust their behavior. They could soften the tension before it exploded. They could restore peace before things became dangerous. That child slowly became the emotional stabilizer of the entire environment. And with that role came something every child desperately needs: a sense of purpose, moments of approval, small flashes of warmth whenever they managed to keep things calm. The nervous system recorded all of this and reached a conclusion. Your job is to feel what others feel. Your job is to fix things before they get worse. That is how you stay safe. That is how you stay loved. And eventually that conclusion became your internal operating system. Not a conscious belief, a reflex. Someone near you feels anxious and your chest tightens instantly. A friend grows quiet and your mind immediately searches for what you might have done wrong. A partner's energy shifts and you're already adjusting yourself to compensate before anything is even said. You smooth tension that hasn't fully appeared yet. You've been doing this every day, in every room, with almost every person in your life, for years. And the real cost of that constant vigilance is not just exhaustion. The real cost is something quieter. Your own inner world slowly fades into the background. Your emotions become harder to hear. Your desires become difficult to identify because you've spent so much energy responding to everyone else's needs that your own feel unfamiliar, almost inappropriate, until eventually the entire system crashes. The empath, who has been running this impossible emotional operation since childhood, finally hits a wall so absolute that the machinery simply stops. From the outside, people think they're watching someone fall apart, but something very different is beginning. Underneath the silence, underneath the withdrawal, underneath the messages you stopped answering and the roles you stopped performing, something rare is happening. For the first time in your life, you are meeting yourself without everyone else's emotional demands filling the space. This is the moment where everything changes. Psychologist Carl Jung described this stage with a very specific term. He called it the descent, not as a poetic metaphor, as an actual psychological phase of transformation he observed repeatedly in his work with patients. Before deep change can happen, a person must go downward into themselves, not sideways into distractions, not backwards into regret, but downward into the parts of their psyche that were sealed away for years. For empaths, this descent can feel terrifying. It feels like loss. Relationships that once felt essential begin to feel heavy. Roles you played for years start to feel like costumes you can no longer tolerate wearing. The fixer, the emotional caretaker, the one who keeps everything together. Instead of dramatically announcing your exit, you simply stop performing those roles. Quietly, you become less available. You withdraw your constant emotional labor. You turn inward. To outsiders, it can look like something is going wrong. But Jung noticed something remarkable about people going through this exact phase. Those who appeared to be falling apart were often doing the deepest internal work of their lives. They weren't disintegrating. They were finally turning toward parts of themselves that had never been allowed to exist. And when they arrived there, they didn't find emptiness. They found everything that had been waiting: unspoken desires, unexpressed anger, grief that had been postponed so many times it hardened into a permanent ache. For years, those emotions were pushed aside because someone else's needs always felt more urgent. Jung believed the unconscious wasn't a dark place. He believed it was a place of hidden light. For someone who has spent decades focusing outward, the interior world becomes incredibly rich, but completely unexplored. The descent creates the silence needed to finally explore it. And when that silence appears, the first emotion that usually rises surprises many empaths. It isn't sadness, it's anger, not mild irritation, not polite frustration, but something ancient and powerful, a rage that has been compressed for years under constant pressure. At first, this feeling terrifies people because it seems out of character. Empaths are used to being gentle, accommodating, patient. But Jung had a word for this buried material. He called it the shadow. The shadow contains all the parts of yourself you were taught to suppress, not because they were evil, but because someone decided they were unacceptable. Inside an empath's shadow lives the anger of someone who carried too much for too long. The voice that finally says what you were never allowed to say. The part of you that recognizes which relationships were actually extraction disguised as connection. The part that admits a painful truth. You gave everything and it was never enough. And deep down, you always knew it wouldn't be. That anger is not something to fear. It's information. Because hidden inside the shadow is not only pain, there is also power. Every quality you were forced to suppress is stored there. Your ability to say no, your willingness to let others deal with their own discomfort, your refusal to sacrifice yourself endlessly. These qualities were not flaws. They were strengths that were trained out of you before you had the language to defend them. As the anger surfaces and you allow yourself to witness it instead of suppressing it, something begins to change. You start to feel more solid inside your own body, more present. For years, your attention lived mostly outside yourself. Now it begins returning home. And after the anger comes something deeper, grief. But this grief is different from ordinary sadness. It isn't about losing something you once had. It's about recognizing something you never received. The safety that should have existed in childhood. The partner who should have met you as an equal. The friendships that looked like connection but were actually one-sided exchanges. This grief brings clarity. You begin seeing the architecture of your relationships exactly as they were, instead of how you needed them to be. And that clarity triggers a question most empaths have rarely asked themselves. What do I actually want? It sounds simple, but for someone who has spent their life prioritizing everyone else's needs, it feels like trying to speak a foreign language. Because wanting something for yourself without immediately considering how it will affect everyone else is unfamiliar territory. For years, your nervous system learned something very specific. Your needs create problems. Your desires cause conflict. It is safer to expect nothing and give everything. Over time, your own wants didn't disappear. They simply retreated so far beneath the surface that accessing them required enormous effort. The descent finally releases the pressure holding them down. What begins emerging during this phase isn't the polished version of you that everyone relied on. It's something more raw, someone learning self-preservation for the first time. Sometimes you swing between old habits of self-preservation, sacrifice, and new instincts to protect your own energy. This awkward stage is what Jung described as dissolution before rebirth. And it's where many people give up because returning to the old role feels easier than continuing through uncertainty. But those who stay with the process begin to experience something extraordinary. They begin to experience themselves from the inside out. For most of your life, your identity was built from reflection. You understood yourself through other people's reactions, through whether the emotional climate of a room improved when you entered, through whether you successfully managed the feelings of those around you. Now in silence, something different appears. A quiet center inside you, a stillness that doesn't depend on anyone else's emotional state. Jung called this the self, not the ego, not the personality, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche. Once you feel this center, even briefly, something shifts permanently. Other people's emotions stop landing on your body like storms. You still perceive them, but there is space now, a pause between what you sense and how you respond. Inside that pause lives freedom. You can notice someone's anxiety without absorbing it. You can witness someone's pain without sacrificing yourself to fix it. You can recognize manipulation without being controlled by it. This is individuation, not losing empathy, but integrating it with strength. You still feel deeply, but you are no longer consumed by every emotional current around you. Interestingly, this transformation doesn't make you less sensitive. It makes you sensitive to different things. Instead of constantly scanning for threat, you start noticing beauty. Music suddenly moves you in ways it never did before. A quiet evening light catches your attention. Your own laughter feels genuine. Instead of med, these moments signal something profound. You are no longer merely recovering. You are arriving. But before this arrival feels stable, there is one more passage most empaths must move through, and it comes from outside. The people who knew the old version of you begin reacting to the change. At first, their concern sounds subtle. They say you seem different. Then the tone shifts. They accuse you of becoming selfish. They remind you how caring you used to be. What they rarely mention is that your previous version existed primarily to support them, and systems resist losing their support structures. For years, you carried emotional weight that allowed others to remain comfortable. When that support disappears, the structure shakes, and people instinctively try to restore the old balance. This is where guilt arrives, not ordinary guilt, a deep surgical guilt rooted in childhood conditioning. The voice that says, if you stop giving, you will be abandoned. If you take care of yourself, you will lose love. But there is something important you now understand. That voice is not your conscience. It is conditioning. Your conscience wants to care for people. Your conditioning wants you to disappear. Learning the difference changes everything, because the empaths who continue forward despite the guilt discover something on the other side. They discover relationships built on authenticity, fewer perhaps, but deeper connections where love does not require self-erasure, where presence feels restful instead of draining, where your sensitivity is not exploited but valued. And when you finally arrive here, your empathy becomes what it always had the potential to be, not a wound, a gift, a powerful ability to understand the emotional texture of life, to sit with someone else's pain without losing yourself, to notice beauty others overlook. You too this time it belongs to you. You decide when to open your heart. You decide when to step back. You decide whose burdens you are willing to help carry. For someone who has never had that freedom before, it feels like breathing fully for the first time. So if you are in the silence right now, if everything feels uncertain, if people around you think you're falling apart, understand this: you are not broken. You are not lost. You are passing through one of the most important transformations of your life, and the person emerging from it is someone the world has never seen before. They are almost ready, and this time they are not returning to disappear. They are returning to live,